Hey, welcome to A Foreigner in the Philippines, and I think a special video is warranted by this weekend, Holy Week, and it reminds me very much, brings to mind very much the book that was instrumental in making a real convert of me. So you'll be seeing the top of my head for a lot of this video, because I want to read some of the things that I read which had such an incredible effect on me. And the book that I read at that time, it was a gift that was given to me by one of my subscribers, and it was by a man called Lee Strobel. And Lee Strobel is a journalist, and he is a journalist with a special twist, a special skill. He investigates court appearances and court cases, and after years of doing this and being very successful at it, and being a writer too, of course, he decided that he would do something that he called The Case for Christ, and that's what he called the book, The Case for Christ. If you want to look this book up, you will find it. Well, it may have a great impact on you. It may. It's an old hackneyed phrase, isn't it? This will change your life. Well, for me, it really did change my life. And the way that this has been put together is that because of who he is and his ability to raise contacts and get the attention and validation that he needs, he was able to set up and arrange a series of interviews with some of the greatest scholars of the present time. And the one that particularly had an effect on me, the whole book was incredibly interesting to me, but he actually takes you through the interviews that he had. And the interview that I particularly wanted, I'm not going to read the whole book to you obviously, but the 10th interview was Alexander Metherell, who was an MD, PhD. Now, just to give you a very quick rundown on Metherell. He had a medical degree, University of Miami in Florida, a doctorate in engineering in Bristol, England. He speaks with scientific precision. He is board certified in diagnosis for the American Board of Radiology, has been a consultant to the National Heart, Lung and Blood Institute of Health, Bethesda in Maryland. He's written 5 scientific books. The man is incredible. You have his name, you can look this up, and you'll find that what I'm saying and what Mr. Strobel is saying is factual. So the doctor, I'll refer to him as a doctor from now on, the doctor has been quoted in this book by the questions that were prompted by Lee Strobel. So Strobel had wanted to know he says, he gave me just a fact. After all, that's all that I was halfway across the country to get. And they talked about the torture before the cross. Now the thing is that if you saw the most recent, in the last, I don't know, 10 or 15 years, there was the actual torture and crucifixion of Christ that was made by the Aussie who did an incredible job, Mel Gibson produced, I think he produced it, but anyway he directed and produced the book about the torture and crucifixion of Christ. So even then we're looking at what actually happened. And if you watched that movie, you would have known that what I'm trying to read to you now was actually they must have used this as some kind of reference. So as we know, Jesus went with his disciples to the Mount of Olives, and specifically they were in the Garden of Gethsemane, and Strobel asked him about a lot of things. He said, for instance, he was very, very ruthlessly detailed in his questions. And he asked the doctor, is it possible that someone could sweat blood? Now, Metro was quite specific. He said, this is a known medical condition, so forgive my medical pronunciations here, hematidrosis. It's not very common, but it is associated with a high degree of psychological stress, which, irrespective of Jesus being the Son of God, he would have been going through some terrible stuff because he knew what was coming. So what happens is that the severe anxiety caused by the release of chemicals that break down the capillaries in the sweat glands. As a result, there's a small amount of bleeding into these glands, and the sweat comes out tinged with blood. We're not talking about a lot of blood. It's a very small amount, but it's definitely there. Now, the other thing that happened then was that it made the rest of the body, all of the skin all over the body, would become super sensitive to touch when you think about what he was about to go through. So he then asked, and Strobel says here he has seen plenty of dead bodies as a journalist, casualties of car accident, fires, crimes, but there was something especially brutal about what Christ went through. So he asked the doctor, what was the flogging like? And the doctor says Roman floggings were known to be terribly brutal, and bearing in mind that the crucifixion was reserved for the lowest of the low, the criminals who were going to be not just killed but tortured and brutally humiliated. So that was what they had reserved for Christ. So they usually consisted of 39 lashes, but frequently were a lot more depending on the mood of the soldiers. Soldiers would use a whip of braided leather thongs with metal balls which were woven into them, and when the whip would strike the flesh, these balls would cause deep bruises and contusions which would break open with further blows, and the whip had pieces of sharp bone as well which would cut the flesh. So what I observed when I watched that movie, which I considered quite authentic, in fact brutally so, it just didn't seem to me that even Christ would have been able to survive that beating. But when the whip hit the flesh and they pulled it out, they were actually pulling pieces of flesh out. So one physician who had studied Roman beatings said, as the flogging continued, the lacerations would tear into the underlying skeleton muscles and produce quivering ribbons of bleeding flesh. Sorry, I'm not trying to be graphic here, but it needs to be known. The sufferer's veins were laid open and the very muscles, sinews of the victim were open to exposure. So we know that many people would die from this kind of beating long before they were ever crucified, but it is clear that Christ survived this. So what was made clear was that there was such a thing as hypovolemic shock, and this is what anyone who would have received that degree of pain would have gone through. So what does it mean? The doctor said hypo means low, vol means volume, and emic means blood. So hypovolemic shock means that the person is suffering the effects of the losing of a large amount of blood. So, do you see any evidence of this in the Gospel accounts? And the doctor replied, Jesus was in hypovolemic shock as he staggered up the road to the execution site at Calvary, carrying the cross, the horizontal beam of the cross. Apparently, the reality was that he was already secured, he was already carrying the part of the cross that he was going to be nailed into, and there's still all kinds of people are offering their opposing arguments about what happened. But anyway, so Jesus was in hypovolemic shock as he staggered up the road, and finally he collapsed, and the Roman soldier ordered Simon, was the man that was ordered to carry the beam for him. Later we read that Jesus said, "I thirst," at which point a sip of vinegar was offered to him. Because of the terrible effects of the beating, this is no question that Jesus was already in serious to critical condition, even before the nails were driven through the hands and feet. So, in those days, I read some other stuff which reinforces how things are done today is also in there. But anyway, death by this crude, slow and inexact form of execution was called crucifixion. In fact, most people aren't sure how the cross kills its victims. So, what happened when he arrived at the site of crucifixion? He would have been laid down, and his hands would have been nailed in the outstretched position in the horizontal beam. This crossbar was called the patibulum. I think I got that one right. The patibulum. And at this stage it was separate from the vertical beam, which was permanently set into the ground. So the poles, they didn't put the pole in there. The pole was already in there. Put Christ onto the beam that had him with his arms outstretched. So the Romans used nails. Now, is there any proof that they used nails? They're talking about something that happened 2,000 years ago. Well, there is. Hold it. I thought the nails pierced his palms, and apparently the nails didn't pierce his palms, or that was not the way that they normally did. If they only pierced the palms and then the body of Christ hung on that, they would have just torn through. It would have been a terrible mess. Instead, what they did was they pierced through the wrist, and that was what happened. They may have used, on some occasions apparently they used rope, but they used nails, and there's a specific reason that would happen. So the nails went through the wrists, although it was considered part of the hand in the language of the day. So it's important to understand that the nail would go through the place where the median nerve runs. This is the largest nerve going out to the hand, and it would be crushed by the nail that was being pounded in. All of this would be incredibly painful. So at this point, Jesus would then be hoisted onto the crossbar that was attached, and it was then attached to the vertical snake. And then nails were driven through Jesus's feet. Again, the nerves in his feet would have been crushed, and there would have been a similar type of pain. Crushed and severed nails would certainly be bad enough, but what kind of stress would this put on his body? Well, Metherell answered, first of all, his arms would have immediately stretched. His arms are stretching about 6 inches in length, which would have dislocated them from the shoulders. And this fulfills the Old Testament prophecy in Psalm 22, which foretold the crucifixion hundreds of years before it took place. And it says, "My bones are out of joint." So that was a a prediction that had already happened, a prophecy. Now, about the pain. So once a person is hanging in the vertical position, the reason that it kills is because essentially what they're doing is they're going through a slow death by asphyxiation. What happens is that the only way that as the body sinks, it brings pressure onto the lungs and it places the victim in a permanent state of breathing out, exhalation. So in order to breathe, they have to press on their feet, which would be excruciating pain, and they would have to lift themselves up just to take a breath. Of course, as time would go by and the pain and the shock, this would cause unbelievable exhaustion. That they just wouldn't be able to do that, and eventually they would go into a particular kind of cardiac arrest. So let me just say, as the person slows down his breathing, he goes into what is called respiratory acidosis. The carbon dioxide in the blood is dissolved as carbonic acid, causing the acidity of the blood to increase. This eventually leads to an irregular heartbeat. In fact, with his heart beating erratically, Jesus would have known that he was on the point of death, which is when he was able to say, "Lord, unto your hands I commit my spirit. Into your hands I commit my spirit." And then he died of cardiac arrest. But even before he died, and this is important too, the hypovolemic shock, which would have caused a sustained rapid heartbeat that would have contributed to heart failure, resulting in the collection of fluid in the membrane around the heart. And this is called pericardial effusion, as well as around the lungs, which is called a pleural effusion. And why is that significant? The doctor maintains that this is significant because what then happened was that the Roman soldier, they had been told that the Pharisees, I believe it was, were on their way, and they wanted to make sure that that Christ was dead. And the reason that this was significant was because the prophecy was that his bones would not be broken, and in order for him not to suffer this, he would have had to be dead. Now, they broke the bones of the two other people, the thieves who were being crucified on Calvary at the same time, and they broke their bones to kill them, and they would break them using the metal shaft of the spear of the Roman soldier. Now the Roman soldier they decided that they would have to make sure that he was dead, even though it was evident that it wasn't. It doesn't take a lot to be able to realize that what they had themselves had been responsible for putting Christ through. They would know that, in fact, they were amazed that he was still alive. One of the other things that Christ said apparently was, "It is done." In other words, the sacrifice that he had submitted to save us all from our sin had been done. And there are two stories I hear on this as to why he thrust his spear into the right hand side of Christ's body. He pushed, obviously Christ is up on the cross, much higher than him. Probably his feet were at the level of his head. He pushed the spear up into Christ's right hand side, which went up through the lungs and into the heart. Now, the reason that that's significant is, I've got to get my place on the book again, because of what happened when the soldier came around, being fairly certain that Jesus was dead, confirmed it by thrusting his spear into his right side. Now, the spear apparently went through the right lung and into the heart. So when the spear was pulled out, some fluid, the pericardial effusion and the pleural effusion, came out. This would have had the appearance of clear fluid, like water, followed by a large volume of blood, as the eyewitness John described it in his Gospel. Now, John probably had no idea why he saw both blood and clear fluid come out. Certainly that's not what an untrained person like him would have anticipated. Now, this is where Strobel goes on to be even more ruthless in his questioning. He said, wait a minute. And he pulled out his Bible and flipped to John 19:30. Wait a minute. He said, when you read carefully what John said, he said blood and water came out. He intentionally put the words in that order, but according to the doctor, according to you, he said to the doctor, the clear fluid would have come out first. So there's a significant discrepancy here. Methero smiled. He said, I'm not a Greek scholar, he replied, but according to people who are, the order of words in ancient Greek were not determined necessarily by sequence, but by prominence. This means that there was a lot of blood, a lot more blood than water. It would have made sense for John to mention the blood first. So there's a whole chapter on addressing all of the reasons that people deny that both the crucifixion happened, and that Christ was indeed dead when he was taken down. The reason that the doctor puts for why this would absolutely have been the case was because if the soldiers took Christ down before he was dead, they would have sacrificed their own lives to answer for that irresponsibility. Their job was to kill, and they knew it. They knew how to do it very, very well. And they made sure that Christ was dead when they took him down. There are even people who think that he didn't die, and that somehow he would have been able, in the condition that he was in, almost by that time devoid of any blood, and so terribly wounded, with his arms stretched 6 inches and the nails in his feet. It would have been so terrible. He would never have been able to survive. He would never have been able to move, and he would never have been able to inspire in that condition what has become known as Christianity. So, having closed every loophole, he still pushed the doctor. Is there any possible way that Jesus could have survived this? Methero shook his head. Absolutely not. Remember that he was already in hypovolemic shock from the massive blood loss even before the crucifixion started. He couldn't possibly have faked his death, because you can't fake the inability to breathe for long. It's asphyxiation leading to cardiac arrest, which leads to the death of anyone being crucified. So someone suggested that Jesus merely swooned on the cross. It's a fanciful theory. There was no swooning to be done. He was so brutally tortured and killed. And he was then put into the tomb, and we don't have to go into that part. The effect that this had on me was in realizing what happened. The the terribleness of what Jesus was put through, what he willingly accepted. He was already in a heightened state of awareness and sweating blood when Judas betrayed him with a kiss, and he knew he was being betrayed. You might remember too that it's authenticated by different apostles that in fact one of the soldiers who came to arrest him was struck, I think, by Paul, and his ear was severed from his head. Jesus picked up the ear, and in an incredible miracle he attached the ear, and that was seen to happen. So what happened with this man who did this book, which had this immense effect on me, was that he went from being his intention, his mission was to prove all of this wrong, but he came out of it as being a convert. All of the people that he interviewed, all of them in all of their condition of having to have studied this in detail, had all been almost self-converted. As Dr. Metherell, he was absolutely a convert. He was a Christian. And Lee Strobel apparently had that as well. Well, certainly it did it for me. I hope that you have stayed with it to the end, because it's important to know that we're in that point now where we may have to stand up for what we believe in, and that may be coming sooner than we think. Thanks for listening. Bye for now. Enjoy your religious weekend. Spiritual at worst. Bye for now.